start. What's going on, everybody? It is I, Free Beer Tomorrow, joined by the big Signorelli himself, Master Signified Bodies,
What is going
the homie
on?
Andrew, and we're back at it again. You know, we wouldn't leave you this long without some Lacan to fill the gullet and to wet your palate. We
Yep.
have here a banger lecture wherein we meet one of the protagonists, one of the main Z fighters within the roster of concepts that we're dealing with. And it's not a coincidence that we're going to be introduced to the Z-shaped schema as well as the big other, maybe the Vegeta of Lacan concepts. Or who is it? I don't know. I don't know who the big other is in this case.
The big
Who would
other.
be appropriate?
Oh, that's a good question. I would say like the free.
Yeah, the big
Yeah.
other. This is one of those concepts, y'all. This is one of those concepts that is going to prove to be one of the mainstay concepts, not just for Lacan, but also Zizek, many different members of the Slovene school. So much is packed into the big other with a capital O. And here is where Lacan first mentions it in contrast to the little other, we could
Right.
call it the
Right.
other with a lowercase o. Andrew, what would you like to say about the big other
Right.
this lecture?
This is the first time that the big other is actually being introduced and elaborated because if you recall in the beginning of the entire seminar, we mentioned that the I is an other, right? Or the ego is an other. And yet it's a capital O. And so we have to get that correct. This time we're talking about the big other, which in this entire seminar, we get the elaboration of the symbolic order. One thing that I've been thinking about, and we've been mentioning that like there are kernels of the real in this seminar and within seminar one, but for the most part, it's talked about as reality in itself. And we get like this instance of what will be a mature version of the real in, the Irma's injection dream. However, we're still dealing with the sort of imaginary symbolic area. And what I would really been thinking about is the paradigms of jouissance. We look at the first paradigm is actually the imaginary relation of jouissance. And what I find interesting about this is that if you look at seminar one, you look at the lure of the misrecognition of the ego, right, in the mirror and in the optical schema. This is a libidinal investment. And yet, right here, he'll talk about how the other capital O is like a confusion, right? And yet it's building this economy. But yet we also have the big other come about, which instantiates something new, something that is in relation to language, which brings in, the function of the other register and, of course, the purpose of the analyst. But right here, he starts us off with a question: why don't the planets speak? Right.
Right. This was the question he left his audience with during or at the end of the previous lecture. Why don't the planets speak? Very cryptic question. He says here that he promised himself to continue with this metaphor, and what unfolds here is an extended metaphor where he continues to go back to this question of why the planets don't speak, but also why in the past they have been made to speak. For what reason have planets been in the past rendered realities. Why are they realities? Why have they been at points in time ascribed a subjectivity? And what does this have to do with speech? Well, the way I interpret it, the big other is the big other of language.
Mm-hmm.
It is the source of language, but also the other to whom we address ourselves beyond the little other as the other that, in some sense, underlies, undergirds language as we find it manifested in the speech of the little other.
Right.
Meaning, what the little other, that is an other ego, another person with whom we're interacting, our interlocutor, what their language refers to, in some sense, we assume finds its terminal point, is hooked to something larger and finalizing behind it, and that would be the big other. This is where speech emanates from, but also it can be, this is just my understanding, the authority to whom we address ourselves, not only when we speak, but when we act, when we try to measure the propriety of our acts and speech against a sort of standard.
Right.
We imagine it is located here and not in the little other, because I can conceive of a little other, of another ego, perhaps as something of a mouthpiece for the big other, but that doesn't mean by any stretch of the imagination that that little other is necessarily an authority. We
Right.
always posit a gap, even when someone speaks for the big other of the law, if it's a judge, if it's a lawyer, if it's an ambassador, even then, although their word carries farther and echoes more resonantly than that of an average person on the street, we still posit a gap between the judge and the law.
Right.
You know what I mean? So someone might speak for the big other, but only insofar as the big other is behind them.
Exactly. And
Sense.
especially like as you mentioned those examples, and you even look at like politics, like POTUS, like that's a great example of someone who tries to stand in for the big other and embody that role. And yet, we also get into the sort of symbolic efficacy of like the face, like somebody like Trump, someone like Biden, etc. Even though they occupy that symbolic authority and are supposed to bring down the executive, or legislative stuff of the big other, they still are an imaginary relation. It's just that we, as like working class or just everyday American citizens, don't have that relation to them intersubjectively. It's always mediated by the circuit of language manifested via media, social media, etc., that they seem to have this elevated status. But when they're with their other political peers, it's this imaginary little other relationship. And there's this sort of disavowal of like, oh, they're just humans, just like rest of us. Oh, they don't really have that much power. We're the ones that are making the votes at the end of the day. And then he signs, the executive orders, etc. And yet there's really like he really doesn't have the sort of what is the term, the container for the big other. Like the big other has no other, therefore there is no big other, because the big other is barred. I think another example to kind of top it off is like when we see capitalists that like have all this money, like these billionaires like or Jeff Bezos and like Bill Gates, for example, like donating to charity and stuff like that. And it's like, well, like, why don't you like end world hunger or something like that? Like, I would, but like, even I'm too a victim of capitalism. I don't have as much power as you think I do, even though I have this money. Like, at the end of the day, my hands are tied. That just shows, like, even then, that there is this gap, as you said, with the imaginary little other, these people with faces, and the big other that is posited by language. I think, to kind of correct what I said that this is the first time that we get the big other. Yes, we get a definition, an elaboration of it in this chapter, but I forgot that he does mention this in the beginning somewhere about how the big other is not like this thing, but rather the totality or the sum of the circuit of language, right? Reflected back into itself. It's like a feedback loop.
I like that.
Yeah.
It's a feedback loop. And we want language to end up somewhere. We want to believe it has its home in an authority, in a kind of a clearinghouse through which it would come back to us and mean ever more with every iteration, with every refinement of what we say, and that will, with every sentence we utter, mean more directly what we intend.
Right.
But we know that we can't rely completely on our own specific idiom to do that. So we have to rely on, as Zizek says, how does he put it? The illusion of a sort of big other.
Right.
Mind, who's speaking, for whom we also maintain the order of appearances. This is why there are many dimensions to the big other. To think of it as only this standard of authority or some sort of despotic signifier in the Deleuzean sense doesn't go far enough, because it is also an entity that in itself doesn't exist but needs to be propped up.
Yeah. I like what you said.
What we do, we have to always be propping it up. We have to always be sort of nourishing this illusion in order to maintain our own consistency.
No, that's it. Especially bringing up Zizek, because I was reading in the Parallax View, and this is where like it really took me a while to understand. But when he's in dialogue with like Mouth, I think that's how you pronounce him, and Leclau, about like their whole thing is that, oh, we had this a hegemonic order that wants to universalize itself, yet it's a false order, so we need to sort of practically create something that's going to be beneficial and universalize itself against the antagonism of the false order. But what Zizek is saying, it's that no, it is exactly this quote unquote false order that you're saying that is the true order. It is the reality itself appearing of this hegemony, and that's what he wants to get rid of like this sort of transcendental thing behind the curtain. It's like, no, that's not there. That sort of mystification is from the veil that there is no big other. This hegemony, yeah, you're right, it's false, but insofar as it appears, and that's all that there is there, that hides the fact that there is nothing there. And really what is at stake is universal antagonisms because of the fact that the big other doesn't exist.
Right, because the big other not existing is to say that it's barred. It is not the same thing as losing one's religion, necessarily losing one's faith in God. To say something doesn't exist at all, never has, it's an illusion, everyone else is duped, I'm not, is one thing. To understand that the other is barred is to say the other does not exist in a very different sense.
Yeah.
Because whenever Lacan says something doesn't exist or attaches not or non in front of something,
Mm-hmm.
he's not saying it has no symbolic efficiency. Quite
Yeah.
the opposite.
Right.
That that fold, that inner fold that prevents it from being whole, that becomes problematic.
Right. And last thing
What
I
the
want to
issue is, yeah,
last thing I want to point out, because I definitely want to get into like what he's like
yeah,
elaborating on about the big other. It's interesting what you said, because it's like it's not enough just to say that the big other doesn't exist. It's to know that it's barred and realize that and traverse through that fundamental fantasy. Because the problem with this and ideology is the fact it's like we know very well that the big other doesn't exist, and yet the disavow is that in our actions we try to be the object or the sort of arbiter to fill in the gaps of that big other. We want to plug the
yes,
jouissance of it, and that's what makes
yes,
ideology perverse, and that's the faith like religion, and how Lacan sees the pervert. Samuel McCormick, the lectures on Lacan guy, actually stated this in his recent lecture. I think it's on seminar 16, talking about the fundamental fantasy is of the big other and the fact that there is no big other, but we try to perversely fill in the big other's lack with our sort of object of enjoyment. That's the last thing I'll say.
perversely. And the last thing
Yeah.
I'll say before we move on is also, and maybe we could just leave it at this, but it's important to note that before Lacan said there is no big other, he said there is no other of the other. So I
Yes.
think you need to actually traverse that first aphorism before you get to the next one for it to really make sense. But anyway, these planets, we're still distinguishing symbolic from imaginary. Why don't the planets speak? There's a strange mention of Hitler and Mein Kampf, very
Yeah.
unexpected. Parmenides,
Right.
crossword puzzles. People don't like to read even back then.
Yeah. It's funny because he says the reason why he isn't a planet is because, for instance, he's rarely altogether happy. The last time he talked wasn't happy, and yet he could somehow find happiness from somebody else, and thus that can make him happy, even though he isn't happy, and therefore that's what makes him different from a planet. And so he asks, like, "What's the difference?" You know, and he's like, "They're not the same happiness." He says, "Happy hyphen happy," and he's like, "If I'm not happy, but somebody else is happy, or I am happy, and then the other is happy, so are they one and the same?"
It's like we attribute a kind of happiness to nature or animals in their contentment. And it's the sort of happiness which we see as absolute because it doesn't depend on the sort of intersubjectivity that
Yeah.
we're all confined to and doomed to
Yeah.
suffer. But he teases out so many different poetic and comical sort of threads from this one metaphor about planets. Some things he says here are really confusing to me. He once again mentions Freud's kettle, which I actually looked this up. There's such a thing called kettle logic
Mm-hmm.
when you have when you make a series of arguments which maybe in and of themselves make sense but are mutually exclusive to back up a point.
Right.
Planets themselves, we have three reasons why they don't. He's making a comment here also on science and what science aspires to accomplish, I think, in a sense.
Yeah.
And also maybe remember the subject of psychoanalysis is the subject of science. So in order to fix the meaning and the efficient cause of psychoanalysis, how it operates as an efficient cause, in the world of science, we have to understand how it differs from science, but how it depends on a scientific discourse at the same time. Because remember, the cogito and the Cartesian subject is the subject of science. It is the subject we're dealing with, in a sense, in analysis, but we're approaching the subject of science as what science tends to neglect. And he says a little bit later in this chapter, well, the ultimate aim of science, in a sense, is to silence the Almighty God himself.
Right.
Whereas planets did once speak,
Mhm.
in the sense that they were, considered as having souls, in a sense. They were animate in a
Right.
certain sense,
Yeah,
even
let me guess,
sentient,
astrology.
perhaps. And now, once again, they are speaking in astrology. People are
Uh-huh.
making the planet speak once again as signs,
Right.
but saying science wishes to silence planets, silence what was once this, anthropomorphizing tendency, I feel like. But he's not saying because, oh, it's not mysticism. He's not saying there is some sort of mana at
Right.
play here that is animate and we've forgotten it. He's not saying that either, but he is saying that what science sets out to do. Well, what do you think? What is science set out to do that it can't?
Well, yeah, like what she said is that first it wants to silence the planets, right? And mainly he talks about what Newton does is create this unified theory, silencing the planets with the concept of gravity, right? Now I don't really know what he means specifically how Newton did that, but I think pretty much like if I had to take a stab at it, it's like because of this, now we don't have to rely on the sort of as you said, mana or animism of the planets to speak, but rather the laws of nature themselves are the guiding principle based upon the subject of science, and yet at the same time, it's sort of concealed, right? Because science at the same time wants to dominate nature. And I know in like other essays, he'll say that science is like paranoid knowledge. It wants to have this sort of identification with its own imaginary relation to the world. And at the same time, silence, it's like this weird contradiction. It wants to sort of displace the big other in these different discourses, and yet create a new one only to kind of like let it out to the door and make the subject of science that, right?
The displacement of the big other, as if the big other consists only of arbitrary symbols which are ultimately deployed in the service of projecting our image onto
Right.
the world, which is what like a lot of naive materialist bros will say is
Right.
oh, man just likes to fashion things in his own image, which is not
Right.
untrue. But here's the thing, it's like what science is doing in that case is it's kind of straw manning the big other. And also even the concept of nature that we have, which would be a de-anthropomorphized, am I saying that
Yeah.
right? De-anthropomorphized version of nature, a silenced nature,
Mm-hmm.
is one that still has ultimately been um, fabricated in a way to serve the aims of the instruments of science that are being
Yeah.
applied to it. Because it's like, okay, we have this nature, like, because science science bros, they also love nature, right? I
Yeah,
mean, doesn't love nature, hiking and all that stuff, but it's also like at the end of the day, when you're done with the experiments,
right,
take a deep breath and you reflect on the marvel that is the natural world. Mike,
right,
look at this, not a man-made thing in sight.
right. And it can
And
only be,
it's,
I was just gonna
I
say, it
was
can
just
only
gonna
be
say,
done
it's
some
like,
by a model that they've created. And like to play on this metaphor about silencing, it's like, well, how do you silence without speaking first? So if the planets or nature becomes silenced at the end of the day, then who does the speaking? Right. Because one thing about these science bros, and Lacan says this in like one of the, I think early chapters talking about Levi Strauss, it's like what they have done in silencing the planets or nature or any other discourse to dominate with their own discourse, they've let God out the front door to bring it back into the back door.
right,
And so that is the
right,
contradiction of the subject of science itself.
right, because that they're the ones who ultimately pronounce the word of
Right.
God,
Right.
but only insofar as this nature that they have fashioned ultimately conforms to the word they've pronounced, but it has no choice, because the idea is that, well, if nature is eternal in some sense, maybe Earth itself isn't, but the movement of the heavens are eternal. Or even if the heat death of the universe destroys everything, in some sense those laws would still in a sense be eternal. They obtain a
Right.
consistency that is the consistency of the real.
Right.
This is another metaphor he uses when he switches to stars, and it has a kind of echo of what he says about the real is that which always returns to its place. The stars always stay in place. And then he's
Yeah.
talking about the velocity of of electrons and stuff, and he's
Yeah.
like, okay, he's imitating the scientists. You get to have velocity, but as long as you move along this trajectory. And
Yes.
to put it a little bit more simply, it's kind of like you only get to qualify as an electron is if you act in this specific way. It used to be everything kind of stayed in place.
Right.
Even like the Democritean form, like atomism, it's just like, they move in a vacuum, I guess. I don't know enough about it. I'm uh
Yeah.
skis here, but like they get to move around in a vacuum, but as long as it stays in place, now it gets to move. But the thing itself, these atoms don't get the final word. We
Right.
sort of tell them what to do, even though the justification for it is these things are acting of their own accord. These phenomena are acting
Yeah.
of their own accord. We're not a part of it, but
That's
we gave
true.
them the name.
Yeah, that's true, because one thing, it's like, okay, so atoms do move in this vacuum, in this void, but it's like the void is still, and yet there is this sort of orchestrated determinism for these atoms that somehow have their own, like there's this law that we have no control of and we're just a part of, and yet we can say that it is God, because I think for the most part, Democritus, Lucretius, I don't think they were proponents of a sort of like, oh, the gods are the order of the cosmos.
No, no, I mean these are atheistic thinkers in their own way, maybe not in the modern sense,
Yeah.
but they are trying to think laws
Right.
without the whims of the
Right.
gods, right? A
Right.
logos rather than a mythos. But let's there are a lot of other little nuances and niceties to what
Right.
he's doing here. There's so much we could focus on, but I like this little anecdote about how
The
he was
scientist.
talking an eminent philosopher, probably Jordan Peterson or something. I don't know. He was asking, the great Stephen Crowder, what he thought about Newtonianism. And No, I mean, what he asked this question, who knows if he actually even asked this question, but why don't planets speak? Because they don't have mouths. And he was disappointed. But then he was pleased by the fact that he was disappointed, because you should never be disappointed with the answers you receive, because if you are, that's wonderful. It proves that it was a real answer. And I like this because you find this oftentimes, especially with philosophy seminars and conferences, and you just you never feel like you got an answer to your question.
Right.
But all the better, because, well, one, there's no good way to answer a philosophical question. Like, you can't hit every beat of what was asked. They're always such long-winded questions, and it's usually just someone, we always just want to hear ourselves make a profound point in the form of a question.
Right.
But also, it's like, yeah, that's the point, that the if it was purely intersubjective overlap, then it wouldn't be an answer. It would just be your question regurgitated. Whereas a
Yeah,
real answer disappoints.
exactly. Because it's not a one-to-one relationship, as
It's not a
Lacan,
one-to-one relationship.
or like as he says, in seminar one, if there's two bodies, you got to account for the third, language. And so somehow, like, it's not like this sort of even mediation, rather it still becomes asymmetrical. Like, it's not like this, the third, the symbolic order doesn't balance things out, right? It actually has gaps. It has contradictions within its own system. And this is, I think, where he's trying to get the point of. This is like where analysis, real analysis, is very effective in disappointing the patient with the answer, because it's not, as you said, the question just regurgitated from the other. It's like, oh, like, not like saying what you want to hear. I'm rather disappointed you with something that was unexpected, and yet at the same time you come back with more questions, right?
Well, what is disappointment? But like, you're not at point you'd like to be.
Yes, yeah,
Point you're appointed differently in a way you didn't expect to be. You're
right.
hooked to something differently.
And this has to deal with the sort of libidinal investment of the ego's imaginary function, the little other. Because this is where we're trying to get at when we understand the relationship between little o and big O, right? The ego as an other, lowercase o, and the big other, right?
Like, look at this example. The person he's asking this question to is an eminent philosopher. You imagine if he really asked this question, he would obviously come off as ironic and kind of a prick in the moment, but this guy falls into the repartee here and says, because they don't have mouths, as if to say, maybe I know what kind of sarcasm you're trying to throw out here. It's sort of like he is also subverting his position as the mouthpiece of the big other.
Exactly.
In that he goes back to, now he's at the level of like little other rivalry,
right?
Let's say,
yeah,
and douchey, I'm going to be douchey back, kind of thing.
Right. And one thing is, because like he states that this is supposed to be like a really big, eminent philosopher. So that right there entitles a sort of symbolic, authoritative placement of occupying the space of the big other. And yet the answer he gets is, as you said, a sarcasm, like stating the obvious, like, oh, the planets don't talk because they don't have mouths. Like, the most like commonsensical, but yet you don't expect that, because it's, oh, like, you're a big philosopher, tell me this sort of profound truth. And yet that disappointment, as you said, it kind of like brings this ego to ego rivalry. And yet what is still not being looked at is the space in which is being occupied, the symbolic order, or
right,
big other. Yeah.
This kind of sarcasm, though, it would only emerge on the condition that they are brought together in a symbolic space. So there's always a symbolic context to even the little other connection. You just can't isolate it completely. But I like what he says here. It reminded me of something you said that always stuck with me, kind of resonates with this dream of Irma's injection, the other flesh, the flesh that isn't seen,
Mm-hmm.
the real of the corporeal, the physical real, which is like a planet, only what it is, nothing more.
Right.
This is an image, as he says, where every gap, every aspiration, every emptiness of desire is lacking. The lacks,
Mm-hmm.
namely whatever it is that really constitutes the property of the buccal orifice. And he's talking about patients he encountered, very old ladies who
Yeah.
would say, I don't have a mouth, I don't have a mouth, I don't have a
Right.
stomach. They're immortal. It reminds me of what you once said about the real as something that one cannot combine with. And it
Right.
sort of evokes that to me
Right.
here as flat and smooth without a place of purchase.
Right. And one thing, so he mentions Cotard syndrome. So I looked it up, and it's like an actual uh disorder of like severe delirium, and to the point where they like doubt that they are like, they're certain that they don't have mouths, they don't have stomachs, and that they're positive that they're even dead. And yet one thing is that even if they know that, even if they're certain that they're dead, it doesn't really change anything. Whereas like the the concept of death, or symbolic death, or literal death, cause extreme anxiety for the obsessive, for the neurotic, which I think is something that he wants to get at, which is a lot different from these delirious patients, which is definitely something kind of it's kind of a detail to kind of keep in mind, and what we're talking about as far as like the real. But and even with that, at that, like, he wants to say that there's this sort of imaginary identification with this negation of a stomach, negation of a mouth, and even identity of death that doesn't take place on the level of obsessional neurosis or hysteria, right? Because there, for the psychotic, right, there is this like overlapping of the imaginary and the real, and obviously the signifier, master signifier, is foreclosed. There's a rejection of that.
Of the master signifier?
Right, yeah, in psychotics, right? And
Oh,
he
in
points, yeah, he
psychotics,
points,
yeah.
yeah, and he points this out because of the imaginary identification, which satisfies desire, which is interesting because desire is never satisfied in a neurotic.
Why does he say here the subject here symbolically identifies himself with the imaginary? He in some way satisfies, symbolically identifies himself with the imaginary.
Yeah, that's why I was and that's what
Satisfies.
I was saying. Like, I could be wrong, like, especially because like if he's talking about like these patients with Cotard syndrome, this is very like synonymous with psychosis, or what he may be getting at when he talks about,
Okay.
yeah, does that make sense?
Yeah. No, this symbolically identify himself with the imaginary, much like the anorexic eating nothing, wanting to
Mhm.
physically eat nothing. It's sort of an identification with what isn't there as
Right.
something that can be encompassed in a
Yes.
strange way. And it you just become a walking paradox.
Right.
Maybe not paradox, but that the impossibility that already lies under the surface of the libidinal reality as the neurotic experiences it just gains a new kind of metaphoricity.
Mm-hmm.
Or a metaphor that comes from a subject incapable of metaphorizing.
Mhm.
They become the metaphor. I don't have a
Right.
I don't have a mouth. But this is the sort of what he says later, partialization, that the sort of chopping oneself up into part objects, which is already what we do in our desires, but
Yeah.
it's just that said out loud without the
Yeah.
expectation you're going to be laughed at. In a sense, it's not, in some ways it's not all that different from what happens in neurosis. It's just it's more of a relationship with language.
Yes, yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
That's the main thing, is the relationship with language. And as like what you've stated, like the lack of, was it propriety within the signifier and the signified, right? Or signifying other signifiers. That's
Right.
what that state, that's what's with psychotics, that there is no propriety with these signs. So therefore there's no metaphorization, right? Or metonymy.
Yeah, well, I guess if our Deleuze Guattarian friends have their way, we'll all not have a
Yeah.
stomach. And then just to focus on this before we take a break,
Yeah.
he says, why do human beings see the great bear in constellations, the Pleiades, the Orion? Is this an overactive, almost psychotic projection
Mhm.
coming from the imaginary onto some sort of thing which in itself doesn't speak, has substantial identity as that which doesn't speak? Or are we dealing with something else entirely?
Right.
Because he says a little bit later on, people think, oh, the symbolic comes from the imaginary. But I believe even now, at this stage, even though Lacan's usually considered immature, or his theory is considered not mature to the point where he can actually deploy the real effectively. I think what he's alluding to here is, no, the real is still the impasse in the symbolic.
Right.
And to think otherwise is to resort to kind of Kantianism.
Yeah. No, definitely.
Um, this is what I was talking before. Well, then, all right, you must always move in the same way. Things have to have their certain velocity, or you just don't pass the muster for being an atom. You're not anything.
Right.
And there's something kind of wrong with that, but science always reserves some time to figure out what
Right.
kind of resembles the thing that it's describing, but doesn't yet, until
Right.
we've observed it long enough to give it a name and know that it will reliably follow the rules
Right.
of being named.
Right, because that's the thing that we always make fun of, like with Chomsky bros, right? It's just like, oh, science knows a lot right now, but it doesn't know everything. But tomorrow we'll know more, and it's just like only enough to name certain things, but never enough to actually say that we've got it right. And
Yeah.
it's funny because it always aims to, especially like physics aims towards a unifying theory, right? That's always been the problem of quantum mechanics, is a unifying theory, and it's always being sort of undermined and then trying to get at again, and then they just find more paradoxes and contradictions, and it's just like, well, we need to observe more. We can only know by our observations, right? Like case in point, the double slit experiment, right? The wave particle duality.
Right, which would almost, to me, seem like a case of not atoms in this case, but photons. right? Lying to us,
Yes.
trying to outwit us,
Yes.
as he says, and like play a joke on us as observers, as if to say, could we make this more clear for you that we're just not going to do what you say if you want, or we'll overcorrect and do both of the things you want us to do, and now you're frustrated with us because we're too capable. It's like I'm making Photon speak. Do you want to take a 5-minute break?
Yeah, that sounds good.
All right. So for 9:42. All right.
That's it. Cool. Perfect. All right. Back at it again. Your mic is silenced.
My bad. Okay, so part 2. You were just talking about a unified field turning men into moons.
Oh,
Do we get them to speak so much only so as to shut them up? Do we get our patients to speak just so that we can transform them back into what they truly are, which is the moons that Hitler describes in Mein Kampf? Or is there something else going on? Are men who have reached the point of no longer needing language
right.
animals?
Right.
This part, he goes off on a nice diatribe against the writer of a very congenial article he read. And this phrase in particular really sticks in Lacan's crawl, the necessity of maintaining the ego's capacity for observation. What do you think of that?
Like, I think what we're getting at is, well, right here, he what he says is that there's talk of mirrors, the analyst that's not bad, but the author wants this mirror alive. So in maintaining the ego's capacity for observation intact, it's like this could also be like what he's trying to get at with understanding the optical schema in the mirror stage, because the mirror stage isn't his own concept. It's something that was obviously created by I think like an evolutionary psychologist, but forget his first name, but Vallon is his last name. But I think other sort of like analysts at the time were kind of criticizing Lacan's early development of it, only to misunderstand what he said, just to like kind of rectify or reify it in a crude way. Like the whole thing about the analyst should be the container for the patient's projective contents onto them and relay it back to them in a sort of positive way, not like positive as in like, oh, nice, calm, but like in a more affirmative way, in that which gives insight, certainty, truth. And that's not what Lacan is saying. Lacan doesn't want to maintain the ego's capacity for anything, because the ego is nothing but a misrecognition, right? What we should get from this entire seminar up until now is that we're aiming at in the Freudian experience, the Freudian subject, right? The psychoanalytic subject of the unconscious, which is the subject without a sort of place marker to account for itself via the ego, right? Because this is what we get in the Irma's injection dream, the subject that can't account for itself. Because what is the ego, right? A misrecognition, but it's in this intersection or crossroads of the subject and the symbolic. I kind of didn't want to say this too soon, but he says this at the end. It is Freud's famous saying, "Wo es war, soll ich werden," which is where it was, the ego shall be, right? And so thinking about how the unconscious works, it's like in the transference, when it already reveals itself in Biao primordial affirmation, or as he'll say, like in seminar 11, the temporal pulsation via speech that opens up and closes. It's like right then you're already too late once it is recognized, and all you're left is with the ego trying to count for itself. That
I really like what you said. Yeah, a subject that doesn't have a place marker for itself.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And this idea of the maintaining the ego's capacity for observation intact,
Mm-hmm.
observation of what, according to which norm should, as he puts it, this pandemonium of egos
Right.
be glued back together.
Yes, because
The norm could only be the analyst as norm.
Yeah, and this is like the problem that like Leclerc and other people are getting even on a good day, is that they want to unify the subject and talk about it in a place marker, in a sort of topography, but what they fail is that the subject can't be located in any specific. It's already gone once it is already announced, right? That's the whole thing he's getting at. The subject is not a unified thing. It's by desire, but the to try to locate it or to account for it is already to give it a sort of misrecognizing imago or image. And that's what he wants to avoid, because then you're talking at the level of the imaginary.
Right. And remember, we're always at the level of the imaginary, in the sense that, remember what Brian Becker said, we're always ultimately in the register of the ego.
Right.
And he says as much in a bit when we'll talk about the Z-shaped schema or the L schema. But what's interesting is that the subject is just another name for unlocalizability.
Yes.
It is unlocalizability. So you're trying to find location of what is only the identity of the unlocalizable.
Right.
So, I mean, like,
this is all what we've been talking about. And for now, about, identity is the identity of difference. Like, the whole thing about like totality, identity, like to even speak about that, or like one, is already in itself inverted, right? And so all you're speaking about is something from a virtual point that doesn't exist.
Right. The point at which anything there is observation going on.
Mm-hmm.
The ego is always trying to keep its capacity for observation intact by remaining mostly unconscious, so that one doesn't get at the nucleus of repression, which is just an empty void, which is nothing. So this is going to happen anyway, right? Unless, but then he gets into what this author is talking about with treating patients who are paranoid or delirious,
right,
or psychotic, in which there is a decomposition of the ego. But it's just funny to me, if I understand this correctly, I might not, that this is almost an example of a logic similar to prohibiting the impossible, in that you're trying to reinforce what's happening on its own anyway.
Yeah.
Keeping the ego's capacity for observation intact. The ego is only its observation of, from a virtual point,
right,
of it's like redoubled self, as one of many objects.
Yeah, and now that I'm thinking about it, it makes sense, especially to tie this in with like the whole thing about paranoia, or like invoking, like, and what he's trying to talk about is like, well, at an imaginary level, you see type of instances of paranoia, like, or what, like the psychiatrist or the analyst that he's critiquing, a paranoia, like due to their techniques, post analyst creates this sort of paranoia reaction. It's like, oh, there's just nothing that we could do. The problem is that they in like mistreating or failure to do analysis in the Freudian sense proper, according to Lacan, what you get is this intact ego ready to constantly be observing. Well, then you get paranoia right there. If observation is redoubled, then all you're getting is an ego that is just like full of paranoia because it sees itself as solidified and whole, and then it's worried about what is purely external to itself, right?
Yeah. Just to bring this down to earth, everybody know, especially nowadays, everybody knows someone like this who is really into therapy, really into therapy culture, who is a kind of, let's call it, grab bag of pop psychology, astrology,
Right.
Western Buddhism, just anything trending that's considered in any way transcendent or has that potential, they're into it. But you see how it's like that they're constantly going on about the strides they've made in therapy or the epiphanies they've been having, and theirs is a series of identifications which have been further solidified and sort of embellished by their analysts, not in this case, they're not analysts, they're therapists who has reinforced these identifications. And the sad thing is, it's kind of like they've reinforced this illusion that there is some sort of coalescence between all of these identifications, and then it creates this anxiety or paranoia when
Right.
those slip apart, because there is no way you can keep the pandemonium of, let's say, individual egos that make up one's identifications together, because they really do have nothing to quote unquote do with each other. There is no symmetry there. They aren't puzzle pieces that fit together to form an authentic self. And I think it's bad for society in the sense that it creates another kind of paranoia. It creates another kind of sorrow that comes from I made all this progress and it all fell apart, and it's like, no, well,
it was bound to happen anyway.
It was bound to happen anyway, no matter how good your life's going, because these identifications are only that.
Yeah, that's all they are. And like, with that, like there's this hypervigilance in all these different modalities to do so, to create wholeness, solidification, individuation, right? And it just won't happen. It's just like, even the confusion of, and this could just be the over pathologization of just alienation and alienation in like the Hegelian, Lacanian sense, not in like the Marxist sense of like existentialism, of like Sartre, just the fact that we are always outside of ourselves, that ultimately, like our essence is a nothingness, like our existence precedes who we are meant to be, and we will never find who we're truly meant to be. These are fleeting. And so like, even these moments of just temporary average everyday suffering, right, gets overly pathologized. And so like, when this person that's hyper vigilant, their own inner cop, it's like, oh, I felt randomly angry, oh, I should be more mindful, like being triggered by their own triggers, that they have to like be their own Karen, be their own cop, but like to a greater degree, depending on what it is, or just like that they feel sad, and that their mindfulness technique, their sort of ability to account for cognitive distortions in the DBT, CBT sense, it's like they're amounting to nothing anymore. It's just like, you're just being human, right? The human condition is a symptom of suffering. Even when analysis is terminated, you're still going to be that. Right.
Don't you want there to be some contrast to being happy so that you can recognize when something does make you happy?
Right.
There's a whole spectrum of things we can
Yeah.
feel, but I love what you said there. Yeah, hypervigilance and also the pathologization of
Right.
alienation
Right.
is yeah. You
It's
said it all. That was
and it's
perfect.
like it's just the irony of it too, because it's like you're doing your best to like be the best version of yourself. I gotta be happy, I gotta, be whole. And then you're going around and you're listening to like, I don't know, like Nirvana or something. Like Kurt Cobain was the most like miserable person ever. But like imagine if he did like mindfulness and he was able to find some type of coping mechanism, how terrible his music would probably be. Like instances of everyday suffering. Obviously he probably was on drugs. I mean, he was on drugs, but like, some
Yeah,
artists
yeah,
that
yeah.
weren't on drugs, but like, were very depressed. Like I know like someone like Linkin Park,
Right.
it's just the average everyday stuff that could actually amount to creating great things,
Yeah, yeah,
that
absolutely.
isn't a negative thing. And
No, no.
the thing to tie it back to what we're getting at right here is just like these triumphs of like the solidified ego ceases to maintain its supremacy because it's just fleeting imaginary misrecognition that can't account for the subject at the end of the day.
And yeah, to put it simply, these analysts don't really know what they even want from their patients,
Right.
but what would it be? The semblance of healthy behavior, the
Yeah.
semblance of thriving, the semblance of being a yes queen or something. I don't know. Like
Yes, queen.
I don't know. And it's funny because we perform that too, especially on social media for others, as if
Yeah.
to say, I don't feel shame. I don't feel guilt.
Yeah.
I am much like this image of the real that we've sculpted, self-consistent, non-barred.
Right,
I
right.
say is what I mean. I've evacuated these negative feelings from my body, but they come back, whether it's in the form of so-called psychosomatic pain or whatever. It's not that you're just doomed to suffer in the way Kurt Cobain did necessarily, but the it in that phrase, that famous Freud phrase, also will find you. So
Yeah.
that's the idea. But what you were saying before about the like paranoia here, this I didn't totally get, because something that this author says does sort of sound like what Lacan usually gets at about psychosis having to do with the falling apart, the disintegration of one's life world in a sense.
Yeah.
But that's not exactly what this author's getting at. And what does he mean here with paranoia? Those are two questions I have.
So I think he does want to like, I think he says right here in the summer that he'll save it like paranoia for the next year, which will be seminar 3, right? But like I think what he wants to get at, which is totally different with what this author is getting at, is that well, one's life role can fall apart in an obsessional neurotic, and that's because like it has to do with the level of desire, right? That they're no longer desiring how they used to, and yet their life world hasn't fallen apart in the way a paranoia or a psychotic does, because, well, they have a different relationship to language, and so they're operating in a different sort of well, they're operating on like a different register, right? A different discourse or lack of discourse. So that's what keeps them from really embracing the human suffering, or their symptom in a way that a neurotic can't embrace it. A neurotic's having trouble enjoying. They're fixated on objects or hysteric. It's the relationship with others, and of course, the big other, right? And
Right.
I think,
Huh.
what's going on is the fact that, like, I think at some points when this author is talking about paranoia, he gets some stuff right, but then he just doesn't ultimately have an understanding of the function of language and the relationship of the big other to what's happening at the level of the little other in which this author is observing.
You just made me think of something that doesn't directly have to do with what you're talking about, but like, remember you were saying earlier about sort of plugging the holes of the big other's enjoyment in a
Yeah.
sense, like what we do, like that is neurosis in a nutshell. But remember, it's like the subject must keep themselves, keep a wide berth between themselves and their own enjoyment, their jouissance. It's threatening. Remember, jouissance is threatening. It's not something we seek directly. We seek
Right.
maybe like a virtual image of it, but we seek we seek a distance from it because jouissance is threatening. It's a conflagration. It's all consuming.
Yes.
And we don't and mostly because we cannot recognize ourselves in it. It's by definition impossible to recognize oneself in one's enjoyment.
Yeah.
So you have to keep a distance from it. But of course, it's alluring at the same time. But what's interesting is that one looks to the big other for answers to the question of, well, how do I enjoy properly? How do I make sure that I maintain the right level of enjoyment? How do I follow the prohibitions which have been mandated by you, the big other, and that will result in me giving you, the big other, the enjoyment that you want if I follow the prohibitions correctly. And that means, and this is where Zizek comes in, that doesn't just mean being a good boy or girl. That doesn't just mean being a gallant and not a goofus. It means like, it also means disobeying the implicit laws which are we're encouraged to disobey. So that's what makes it really interesting. It's like you're always trying to decipher the desire of the big other, which there's no it doesn't desire in that sense. Like it doesn't know what it wants. So that's where it gets really complicated.
Oh, and then talking about jouissance, right? As you mentioned earlier, like again, talking about, and so far as Lacan is in the imaginary, like in sort of the stages of Lacan, the early Lacan is stuck in the imaginary, middle Lacan symbolic. We should see that not just chronologically, but also, as I said, on the paradigms of jouissance. So like there is just this so much for him right now, this dialectic of narcissism and the Kojevian master slave dialectic is the sort of investment in this imaginary scene of misrecognizing and confusing oneself, that we can never see the improper function of the agent that's supposed, or the other ego that's supposed to occupy the space of the big other. And going back to him talking about a prominent philosopher and getting like a disappointing answer, it's like he's disappointed, but right there he couldn't see past or he confused the forest for the trees for the most part, because he couldn't see the lack of the big other, right? In this philosopher, he could only see his imaginary investment via the retort of the sarcasm. And this is what the problem is for psychoanalysis, and what he's getting at is that the patient is always going to be lured by the imaginary identifications, even when the big other speaks in them, and when it goes via the transference. That this is the problem of the dialectic of narcissism and the overall jouissance that's taking place in the imaginary, the lure. It's that no matter what, they always want to resort back to these identifications. But no, you got to see the subject that's speaking, and instead of being this mirror that allows the patient to unify an ego that's hyper vigilant and observational, it's like, no, we need a mirror that cannot bring an imaginary lure, but a naked barred subject.
Ours.
Yeah.
Ours.
Yeah.
Let's spend the rest of the session talking about one of my favorites, a little schema forerunner, maybe we could say,
Yeah.
to Graph of Desire in a
Yeah.
sense. This is one of
Yeah.
the, we had the optical schema, and here we have the L schema.
Yeah, you love this one, so break this shit down.
You can put me on the spot. It's the subject's
I'm,
supposed to know.
I'm
I
about
did
to
write.
Hippolyte you.
What?
I'm about to make you the Hippolyte of this.
Oh no, I'm gonna be sweating. I'm gonna be sweating. This I did write an essay wherein this figured. I mean, partly because I wanted to do some gimmicky shit where this is like a Z and the essay was about Dragon Ball Z, and I thought I was hot shit because I like pulled this out. But it was kind of cool. Yeah, but it's more of an hourglass here. You can find some versions of it that don't have this this transverse arrow. But yeah, the L schema, all right. I mean, Brian Becker, of course, does a better job than I could of breaking this down in one of his videos. Oh, the ego is an imaginary construction. We've been dealing with little others up until this point, and here we have, at this level, the subject's relationship with the little other. As he says at one point, we are always confined to this dynamic. He may believe the ego's in him. Everybody is at that stage, and there's no way of really getting out of this. The whole point of analysis, though, and I don't know if he would agree with this later in his career, he'd probably disown this schema. But as always, we're talking about the Lacan of the early seminars, is to get this to speak and penetrate the imaginary wall
Right.
that's going on here, the big other. I get confused a little bit because we have, well, I guess this is the actual other of just like another person
Right.
into contact with.
Yeah, for the
Need
ego.
another person, like for intersubjectivity to occur. And again, Lacan abandons in intersubjectivity later, but at this point, for intersubjectivity to occur properly, like you need to encounter another human being at some point, not just be a complete cloistered monk. This other has to be in play, but this other has a relationship with the ego. There's an imaginary relation between this other and the ego, but it's the unconscious that has a direct relation with the subject. And I think this is the trajectory of the symbolic here.
Right. Yes.
Yes. Because the subject, as you mentioned earlier, just think about it in the sense that, well, the subject is the subject of language. It's the I. We always use the I here. For him here right now, he's using S as the German S, which is similar to what you quoted before from Freud, right? Wo es war. He's deliberately invoking that with this, but with this S, but it's like, okay, with language, as soon as there's an I, you assume you will ultimately come to envelop that I It must mean something, must refer to something. Darian Leader, I think, calls it the ellipsis
Mm-hmm.
in language. Maybe it's the remark in a Derridian sense. It's just what makes language possible at all, but it's its own evanescent point, its own vanishing mediator, let's say.
Right. Yeah.
Uh,
Yes. Yes.
the but the ego, on the other hand, has a certain illusory solidity to it, in as much as it evokes. It depends on an imaginary relation. We could say it's here, it's there, it's never in one place, but the identifications that make it up can be isolated. They can be fanned apart.
Right.
The unconscious, on the other hand, is a language unto itself. It's language without the big other, maybe we could say,
Yeah.
but that doesn't make sense because it's emanating from the big other. But the big other, remember, there's no other to the of the other. The
Yeah.
big other doesn't need to follow any rules because it's already the big other. It's the source of language. Why does the source of language itself have to follow rules? But at the same time, the unconscious does follow certain strange rules, but they're only rules that appear in the moment. I don't know if I'm
Yeah.
doing a good job of explaining this,
Oh,
but the
but
imaginary relation is like the wall of language. I'm a
yeah.
little all over the place here, but what do you want to add to that?
But no, and it does make sense because if we talk about like the function and field, like what is the unconscious but the discourse of the other, right? And in that discourse, it is the subject evoking that other, right? With capital O, the barred subject, right? And it's the ego using the early in terms of empty speech and full speech. The ego caught in the imaginary relationship or the intersubjectivity, no matter how many different egos you get, whether it's just two bodies, three bodies, right? Four bodies. These are all still imaginary relationships that conform to the empty speech, this mediated speech, which is the Heideggerian Das Man, right? The they talking about, well, who's they, though overall you could account for no matter how many people in the room, and still none of them can account for the big other, like we said in the beginning. Even somebody in a symbolically hierarchical position can still cannot embody to the T the big other, or can be the other for the other.
Right. But I wonder, so the big other lies at the heart of the unconscious. It I don't know, I don't want to just say it is the symbolic order, but maybe what is thought to circumscribe the symbolic order.
Right.
It's in us
Right.
in a sense. And the imaginary relation here is how we make sense of the world.
Right. So, and here's another thing too that's pretty kind of confusing because, like, all right, so we all know that Zizek says that there is no big other, right? Lacan says there is no big or the other for the other. However, I remember Chiesa saying that he doesn't agree with this, that even at the end of the day, that we're still going to have some sort of big other, some virtual other, even if it doesn't undermine us, right? And what I'm thinking is that, like, some sort of symbolic order, maybe that brings some symbolic exchange, right? The gift, right? These kind of clans, kinships, alliances, some symbolic orders that still function on a big other to an extent. And what I'm thinking is just like, we'll look at the function of the super ego, right?
Yeah, but Zizek does believe that the big other has a certain symbolic efficiency. It just
Yeah.
doesn't have self consistency.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
That's what it means to me. The unconscious, on the other hand, it's this combinatory it's a language that follows its own rules, but I think the rules that it follows, again, if the big other doesn't have self-consistency, then its rules are to an extent arbitrary, but that doesn't mean that they appear purely arbitrary. Just like a Freudian slip doesn't appear arbitrary. It can, but more often than not, its sense renders itself immediately.
Yeah.
In that there's like another set of rules that are not the rules we find on this plane.
Right. Okay. Yeah. I'm tracking.
But at the same time, there are a set of rules that only depend on the set of rules that's in place in the imaginary relation, and yet subverts. That's why this arrow is clashing with this imaginary relation, because it subverts what's going on this plane, but it also breaks up. That reason this line is dotted here, because what the unconscious penetrates the imaginary relation, it reflects on the subject. It doesn't reflect on the ego. That's why the ego is bewildered by this breakthrough. And it's broken up, I think, almost to imply a kind of incoherence at this point that reaches the subject, makes the subject itself incoherent. This part, this though, I get a little confused by. It's the subject, and
in that,
what's the relation between the subject and the other of another person, another subject?
What I'm thinking of is if that a other isn't necessarily an other person, but possibly the ego ideal. Because what is the ego ideal but the imaginary identification of a symbolic statement, prohibition, injunction, right? That can take the place of,
I don't think so, just because it could, well, no, it could have something to do with that. But he says here it perceives what we call, for structural reasons, its fellow being in the form of the specular other. This is which definitely has a lot to do with the ego ideal. But I don't think it's like the ego ideal, it's the specular other. The analyst would be the analyst. Okay, well, the analyst, wouldn't you say, like, initially is thought of as just another apostrophe other, another specular other,
right, and then I think
it occupy the place of the big other here,
right, and that's what would kind of break that imaginary relation, right?
Yeah, and it's like, but I still get confused by the subject's direct relation with the specular other. Doesn't make a lot of sense to me. But
we're gonna be here all day.
Yeah, we could be here all day. Help us, Brian Becker. If someone knows him, shoot the Becker symbol into the sky so that he'll swoop. How cool would that be if he just?
I know. Help me, Ben Kenobi. Obi-Wan Kenobi, you're my only hope.
And then it's just like this sort of star swipe entrance. Yeah, it's fine because I wrote something about this and now I'm more confused than ever.
Right.
I like this idea of the wall of language, though. The imaginary gains its false reality, which nonetheless is a verified reality, starting off from the order defined by the wall of language. And, well, the wall of language, I think, where does he say that behind the wall of language? Okay, here it is. Yeah, I want to read this part. They, the true others, big others, true subjects. Okay, this might help us answer our question, maybe. They are on the side of the wall of language there where in principle I never reach them. Fundamentally, it is them I am aiming at every time I utter true speech, but I always attain a double dash through reflection. I always aim at true subjects. I have to be content with shadows. The subject is separated from the others, the true ones, by the wall of language, which is this wall of language is this, though, the imaginary relation.
Right. Okay.
This,
Yeah.
so maybe it's like, I think it, if I talk to you right now, this is what's going on. The imaginary relation is going on right now between us. But it's almost like the idealized communication that's going on, I could be wrong about this though, is like seeking the subject in the specular other.
Right.
The
Yeah. Yeah.
true subject behind the scenes of the, you know, meat and potatoes reality that with in specular others physical being. But I don't know if that's quite it either.
Yeah.
It's
No.
it's a tough one. I'm gonna watch after this. I'm watching Brian Becker's video about
Yeah.
this.
On the L schema.
Yeah, check that out, y'all.
Yeah, we should drop that in the
Um,
link. Drop the link down below. In the description.
if speech is founded in the existence of the other capital O, the true one language is so made as to return us to the objectified order other. Oh,
Yeah.
as objectified other to the other whom we can make what we want of, including thinking that he is an object, that is to say that he doesn't know what he's saying, like a planet.
Right.
We use language, our relation with the other always plays on this ambiguity. In other words, language is as much there to found us in the other as to drastically prevent us from understanding him. And
Right.
that is indeed what is at stake in the analytic experience.
Right. Like again, it comes back to like the with language and the objectified other. It's like going back to the word elephant, and how much we could talk about it, and it, the elephant doesn't have to be there. And I think in this sense that it's language can function to objectify this other ego, in a sense that we don't get at, the maybe big other, even though the big other is the source of language. Somehow certain like speech can actually mystify and keep us from knowing or breaking through the wall of language, right? Because we've created so much associations.
To really get at the big other in the big other's confusion, as a confusion,
Right.
as something which folds in on itself. Whereas again, the kind of distance we maintain from it gives it, and we maintain distance also from the other. But what we're talking before about these virtual images of the big other, these sort of incarnations of the big other and the specular other,
Right.
but they also keep us from encountering the big other's non-existence, the big other's confusion with itself, the gaps in the big other, because the specular other feels less riddled with gaps,
Right.
insofar as I'm able to sort of like pour my own image into the receptacle of the specular other.
Right. Oh yeah.
Uh,
Yeah.
why does he say we should finish up, but why does he say this? The breasts of Tiresias eat the feet of your analyst in the same sauce. What?
That one cracked me up. I'm wondering if like, well, he does talk about how like right before he says that he says the notion of imaginary assumption of partial objects through intermediary of the figure of the analyst leads to the kind of I think this is a Latin term, comulgatorio, to use the title which Balthazar gave to the treatise of the Holy Eucharist, the imaginary consummation of the analyst, which I think what he's trying to say is like, insofar as we go back to this thing of like, again, these psychiatrists, these analysts trying to instantiate a mirror for the ego to become more observatory and solidified. Well, it's not that, they're making this person purely individualistic, but dependent upon the analysts themselves, that it becomes this, one-to-one ratio or relationship that really the analysan is able to seed ground relative to desire because of, let's say, the countertransference of the analyst, and has created partial objects of themselves to become consummated, and therefore like is being able to identify with the analyst.
So there's a kind of dismemberment.
Yeah.
That happens in like the specular image is not. Yeah, maybe. Well, in the mirror stage is just as much about dismemberment as it is
right
constituting the body, also taking it apart. You know what I mean? Like, I work with young kids, and when they get something new, like a pair of sneakers or something, they can't leave the object alone. You know what I mean? It's like I was watching this kid today, just like playing with his Jordans. It's like you just can't leave it alone. There's just like this desire to take off the sneaker to put it back on. That it's like that's what clothes allow us to do, not just feel whole, but also to sort of dismember ourselves. I think I'm just kind of like,
no, I get what you're saying, but there is partial identification with these things,
we want. Well, what is this? He calls it partialization. Can you unpack a little bit more?
Well, I think what it could be is
just this, as opposed to being a moon, as opposed to being, what you are, full, whole, without orifices.
Right. Well, it could be, again, like if we partialize the analyst, it's their gaze, their mouth, their speech, right? All these things.
But why do we want to break it? Why do we want to partialize them, though?
I would say, because I'm gonna be honest, I'm confused as you, but if I had to take a stab at this is because maybe he's getting at the sort of partial drives, right? He still doesn't have a sort of theorization of it, but like we're getting at something along the lines of partial drives. And I could have sworn he brings up something along the lines of that right before he mentions this in the page prior, with like the pregenital and the sort of Freudian libidinal stages, but I could be wrong. But I think that has to sort of deal with that, because we never get the animal as whole, right? It's always a sort of way that maybe desire or our own fantasy wants to partialize on an imaginary sense, or the good and bad of the analyst. I think this, thinking about it now, this is kind of like the era of object relations, because this is what the analyst wants to see themselves as, a partial object for the patient to integrate an ego and object relation, right? The good breast versus the bad breast, right?
Yeah. You're supposed to render later, we like this the idea of the analysts like cadaverizing themselves, whereas with the object relation, it's sort of like, let's say the analyst is only perfectly whole to the degree that they are able to render themselves something like a planet that
Right.
doesn't, or a cadaver or something, whereas with object relations, it's like turn yourself into the good breast, turn yourself
Yeah.
into
Right.
a partial object to complete whatever, I'll complete you or something like
Right.
this. Huh, yeah.
Yeah,
This
this
is
is why it's like an imaginary consumption. I mean, like look at like he's bringing up religious motifs, so like to kind of play off of that, I look at like the rituals of like Christianity and consuming the body of Christ or the blood of Christ. These are you know symbolic fetishes that rely on imaginary egos to consume, and therefore in this cadaverized process be able to become one with God, right? And so, like the analyst, in a sense, is trying to make that condition possible for the ego of the analyst and to do that to instantiate some type of wholeness, which is not what Lacan wants. But it's like we're so inclined to do so because of this. Again, I could be wrong, but I want to play along with this imaginary jouissance is so inclined to do because of the misrecognition that comes with imaginary identification.
I'm just reading this
Right.
again. The subject authentically reintegrates his disjointed limbs and recognizes,
Right.
reactivates his experience. Wo es war soll ich werden. The, do you think does Lacan sound sort of like overly optimistic at this point? Doesn't it seem like at this point he thinks he does say, okay, there this is an ideal moment, that of a fully realized subject, but one must aim for it. It's an ideal of analysis which remains virtual, but it seems
Right.
like what he's driving at is something like the reintegration, reconstitution of
Yeah.
the body, the subject.
Yeah. And I feel like what is going to be reintegrated or reconstituted is what he says even in seminar one, that of naming your desire. I think that's what it is, but not the ego, right? And I don't know if that's still if that verbiage or that frame of thought is still going to be valid in the later Lacan, because I know like he'll talk about in Seminar 11 like you know the antinomy of enjoyment and of the drive and really sexuality and sublimation as the goal, right? The moment I'm not fucking, I'm talking. So I don't know. Your guess is as good as mine.
Um,
Yeah.
I feel like this is important.
Yeah.
I think we should end it there,
Right.
although I'm completely satisfied. Good. That's a good thing, right?
Right.
We're
That's
disappointed. We didn't
yeah.
get the answer we were looking for, and that's what Lacan wants. It's it when it's not going as smoothly as we'd like, that's a good thing.
Right. Yeah.
Anyone watching this, please, if you've made it to the end, I doubt many do. Give us your thoughts, really.
For
Give
real.
thoughts. Just no, don't scatman it. Just try to revise what you write after you say it. All right. Peace.